Why would a broken farmer stake his last dime on a lame horse no one else dared touch? In a windswept Montana town, Walter Briggs bet his heart on a scarred golden palomino, defying storms and scorn. Their unbreakable bond led to one heart-stopping moment that hushed a roaring rodeo and rewrote their destiny forever. The late autumn wind carried dust across the wooden pens of the small auction yard in rural Montana. Rusted gates creaked as tired ranch hands moved restless animals from one enclosure to another. The crowd was lively, though the atmosphere was less about commerce and more about spectacle. Farmers, ranchers, and families with children had gathered in their jackets, boots caked with dirt, and eyes sharp with the anticipation of bargains. Among the animals lined up for bidding, one horse drew particular attention, not for its strength, but for its frailty. Tied to a post, a palomino with a golden honey coat stood trembling, the creamy white mane tangled with dust, its tail dragging slightly on the ground. A long white blaze ran down its forehead, catching the sunlight like a streak of fallen starlight. Yet the beauty was marred by the limp in its hind leg. Every step was uneven, hesitant, almost painful to watch. People in the crowd chuckled cruelly. "That one's good for nothing but dog food," a man jeered, spitting tobacco into the dirt. Another laughed. "Maybe glue for the schoolhouse." The horse, however, kept its head high, eyes steady, refusing to bow to humiliation. Walter Briggs stood apart, arms crossed over his chest, his old felt hat pulled low. At 38, he bore the look of a man older than his years. His limp was subtle, but permanent, the ghost of a rodeo accident that had ended both his youth and his pride. Once, he had been a rider with dreams of championship. Now he was just another small farmer, barely holding on to his land and struggling with overdue mortgage payments. The smell of hay mixed with dust filled his lungs, but what he truly inhaled was the sharp sting of recognition. The horse was him, broken, but still standing. From behind him, his mother Martha leaned close. Her gray hair was tucked under a knitted scarf, her eyes gentle yet firm. "Walter," she whispered, her voice almost lost in the clamor of the auctioneer. "Sometimes we don't save the horse. Sometimes the horse saves us." Her words landed like a stone in still water, rippling through the ache in his chest. He turned to look at her, searching for doubt, but she only nodded, as if she already knew what he was thinking. The bidding began with mockery. The auctioneer's voice rattled through the microphone. "Startin' low. Who'll take this one for $50? Laughter rippled through the crowd. Some tossed out numbers as jokes. 20, 10, 5. A boy in the back shouted $1 and set off another round of laughter. The palomino flicked its ears but did not flinch. Its dignity was stubborn, even when no one cared to see it. Walter's hand shook slightly as it hovered near the billfold in his pocket. He had little left. The harvest had been lean, the cost of fuel and feed climbing. He knew the weight of every dollar, what it could buy in groceries, what it could delay in medical insurance premiums, what it could mean to the roof that leaked every spring. Yet, in that instant, the decision was not about finances. It was about refusing to let something noble be thrown away like garbage. A mocking voice rose above the crowd. "Hey, Briggs, you should buy it. Perfect match for a washed-up cowboy with a bad leg." Laughter erupted again, led by Hanson, the wealthy ranch owner whose smug grin had long haunted Walter. Hanson's cattle operation sprawled across half the county, while Walter's land barely kept him alive. Every insult carried an old sting of rivalry, but today it cut deeper because it was true. Or it would have been, if Walter turned away. Without waiting for his fear to settle, Walter lifted his hand. 100. The crowd hushed. No one had expected it. The auctioneer blinked, caught off guard, then barked into the microphone. We got 100. We got 100. Anyone go higher? Silence. Hansen smirked, but did not move. No one else was foolish enough to raise the bid. Sold! The gavel came down with a crack, echoing through the dusty yard. The Palomino snorted softly, stamping its good leg. For a moment, Walter swore he saw the horse's eyes soften, as though it understood the weight of what had just happened. He stepped forward, took the rope, and felt the raw strength trembling under the animal's hide. It was a fragile strength, wounded but unbroken. As Walter led the horse away, voices followed him. Some shook their heads. Crazy fool! Others laughed. Throwing money down a hole. But Walter didn't look back. He heard only his mother's words echoing in his mind. Sometimes the horse saves us. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the snow-dusted peaks, Walter stood by the fence line, the golden Palomino beside him. The wind had softened, carrying the smell of pine from the hills. The horse leaned slightly into his shoulder, cautious but not pulling away. Walter exhaled slowly, a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. He whispered, almost to himself, "Maybe we both deserve one more chance." The horse flicked an ear, as if answering. And that night, under the first frost of approaching winter, Walter Briggs carried the weight of a decision that would soon test every ounce of patience, pride, and hope left in him. The frost of that first night had not yet melted when Walter Briggs realized the weight of his choice. The Palomino stood in the corner of the corral, golden coat catching the early light like embers in the ash of dawn. Its breath rose in pale clouds, steady but uncertain. Walter leaned against the rough fence rail, arms crossed, his limp sharper, in the cold morning. He could feel the ache in his leg, the echo of a rodeo arena long behind him, and the echo inside whispered the same words that haunted him since the auction. One more chance. The neighbors did not wait to remind him of his supposed mistake. By mid-morning, Hansen's hired hands passed along the road, their laughter drifting across the fields. "Briggs bought himself a lawn ornament," one shouted, setting off another round of jeers. They did not stop. They did not need to. The sound carried like smoke, lingering in the air long after the riders disappeared into the distance. Walter's jaw tightened. He could swallow insults, but he could not shake the fear that maybe, just maybe, they were right. Martha emerged from the porch, her shawl wrapped tight against the cold. She set a mug of coffee on the fence post. "Don't let their words get into your bones, Walter," she said softly. Her voice had the patience of years, a steadiness that had carried them through lean harvests and unpaid bills. A man's worth isn't measured in acres or cattle, or in insurance policies or bank accounts. It's in whether he still dares to care for something fragile. She glanced at the horse, its creamy mane lifted in the wind, and then at her son. "You cared when no one else would." Walter sipped the bitter coffee, the warmth sinking through him. "Or maybe I just threw the last of my savings down a pit." He didn't say out loud what worried him most, that he had risked the mortgage again, that this gamble might cost him the farm his father once built with bare hands. In his pocket, the folded notices from the bank still pressed against his thigh. Reminders that the world measured mistakes in interest and debt, not in courage. From the gate came a shuffle of small boots. Billy, the boy from the next ranch over, leaned in, eyes wide with wonder. His coat was too thin for the cold, his hair sticking out in every direction, but his grin was bright. "Mr. Briggs," he said eagerly, "is it true you bought him? For real?" Walter nodded, and Billy let out a whistle. "He's the prettiest horse I've ever seen. Looks like the sun got caught in his coat." The boy reached his small hand toward the fence, but pulled back when the Palomino snorted. "He's hurt," Walter said, more harshly than he intended. Then softer, "Takes time to build trust." Billy's eyes never left the horse. "I can help. I know I ain't strong, but I can fetch water, clean stalls. Please, I've read books about horses. I can sit quiet so he knows I ain't mean." His eagerness was disarming, and Walter found himself caught between refusal and recognition. The boy's father had died the year before, a ranch accident no one spoke about in detail. Since then, Billy had haunted the edges of ranch life, hungry for belonging. Walter saw that hunger now, the same hunger he himself carried for years, though he had buried it under silence. "Your chores at home come first," Walter said gruffly, but the boy's smile broke through his sternness. Against his better judgment, Walter gave a small nod. "You can come by after school. Just don't get in the way." The words were hardly out before Billy ducked through the fence, his boots sinking into the dirt as he stepped closer to the horse. The Palomino watched him warily, ears flicking back. Billy stopped short, lowering his eyes the way he had seen ranchers do with skittish colts. He held out his hand, empty, trembling with excitement. "Hey, Comet," he whispered. The name had come easily to him, as though it had been waiting in the air. "You're like a shooting star." Walter stiffened at the word, but the horse did not move away. Instead, Comet blew a slow breath, then turned its head as though considering this small boy with the reckless courage of innocence. For the first time, Walter felt something shift. A horse that had every reason to distrust still chose to stand, golden hide shining against the gray boards of the corral. Later that evening, when the sun slid down behind the snowy peaks, Walter carried the last bale of hay into the stall. His hands were raw, the ache in his leg sharper after a day of labor, but his gaze was fixed on the Palomino. It ate slowly, each movement deliberate, the white blaze on its forehead catching the lantern light. Martha stood at the doorway, watching both her son and the horse. "People will talk," she said quietly. "They always do. But pride isn't about proving them wrong. It's about living with your own choices when the laughter fades." Walter rested his hand against the stall door, his fingers pressing into the splintered wood. Pride. The word carried the weight of years, of rodeo glory lost, of fields left unplowed when storms came, of debts piled higher than the harvest. Yet standing here, with the warmth of the horse so near, and the sound of Billy's laughter still echoing in the yard, Walter felt something new stir beneath the old scars. He didn't know yet if this gamble would break him or save him, but for the first time in a long while, he wanted to find out. And as the lantern flickered low, casting long shadows across the stall, Walter whispered to the horse, "Tomorrow, we begin." The following morning dawned gray and brittle, the kind of cold that seeped into bone and wood alike. Walter pushed open the stable door with his shoulder, the hinges groaning as if they, too, resented the work ahead. Inside, the air was damp with the scent of straw and old wood, a quiet world apart from the laughter and gossip of neighbors. Comet stood near the corner, golden coat dulled by dust, mane tangled in creamy knots, one hind leg bent awkwardly but firm enough to keep his frame upright. The lantern light traced the white blaze down his forehead, a streak of brightness in the dimness. Billy trailed behind, carrying a bucket of water too heavy for his small arms. The handle clanked against the side, spilling drops that froze almost as soon as they hit the ground. "He needs it fresh," Billy said with certainty, though his breath came in huffs. Walter took the bucket from him and set it down near the trough, saying nothing. The boy crouched, his eyes fixed on the horse. The silence was thick. Every shuffle of hooves, every drip of water echoed like a drumbeat. Comet watched the boy with wary eyes, muscles tightening each time Billy moved too quickly. Walter leaned against the post, arms folded, studying the exchange. The stable had always been a place of labor for him. Hay bales, broken tools, endless repairs, but now it felt like a chapel, where silence itself carried the weight of prayer. Billy lowered himself to the straw, sitting cross-legged. "If I stay quiet, he'll know I mean no harm," he whispered. Walter raised an eyebrow, but he let the boy be. Hours passed slowly. Comet shifted once, twice, but did not retreat farther into the shadows. When the boy finally extended a hand full of grain, the palomino hesitated, nostrils flaring, then stretched its neck forward. The sound of soft chewing filled the space, breaking the silence like a hymn. Walter's chest tightened. He remembered his own first mount years ago, the thrill of trust earned through patience. He hadn't thought he would ever feel that again. Yet here, in this dim stable with straw clinging to his boots and pain throbbing in his leg, the spark of that old feeling flickered. The day wore on with simple chores. Walter forked hay, Billy swept clumsily, and Martha arrived with a small pot of stew for them both. She didn't comment on the horse, only on the steadiness of Walter's hand as he worked. Outside, the sky dimmed, and snow began to fall, flakes drifting silently past the stable window. Inside, warmth gathered, not from fire, but from presence. The boy, the mother, the wounded animal, and the man who still wasn't sure if he was rescuing or being rescued. Later that night, Walter sat alone on the wooden bench, lantern nearly out. Comet stood with one hip lowered, eyes half closed. The hush was absolute, broken only by the occasional crack of wood in the cold. Walter leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and whispered, "We're both stuck here, aren't we? You and me. Broken legs, broken pride." His voice was low, raw, carried into the straw and shadows. Comet shifted, the sound of hooves soft against the floor, and stepped closer. Not enough to touch, not yet, but closer than before. Walter did not move, did not breathe. The horse's golden coat gleamed faintly in the lantern light, and for the first time since the auction, Walter felt the silence as something whole, not empty. When Billy returned the next morning, he found Walter asleep on the bench, chin tucked to his chest. Comet stood only a few feet away, watching over him as though the roles of guardian had been reversed. The stable, once only a place of chores and shelter, had become something else entirely. It was now a place where silence healed, where trust grew slowly in the stillness of shared breath. And from that silence, the first fragile thread of belonging began to weave itself between man, boy, and horse. The first signs of thaw had not yet touched Montana when Walter decided the waiting was over. For weeks, the stable had been filled with silence, patience, and the quiet ritual of trust building. Comet now stood calmer when the boy approached, no longer shrinking into the shadows, though its golden hide still shivered under any sudden sound. Trust had been seeded, but Walter knew trust alone would not heal a leg, nor would it teach either of them how to begin again. On a morning when frost glazed the fence rails like glass, Walter walked into the stable carrying nothing but his calloused hands and a length of soft rope. Billy followed, his eyes wide, clutching a notebook in which he had scribbled every observation of the horse since the auction. Martha lingered at the doorway, her shawl pulled tight, saying nothing but watching with the steady faith she had always given her son. Walter spoke low, his voice even, meant as much for himself as for the horse. "All right, boy. Time to see what you've got left." He stepped closer, holding the rope loose, not forcing. Comet shifted, the creamy mane catching pale light, ears flicking back with unease. For a tense moment, Walter feared the fragile connection might break. But Billy crouched nearby, whispering encouragement the way a child speaks to a secret friend. "You're safe, Comet. We're here. Just try." Walter reached out, letting the rope brush against the horse's shoulder. Comet trembled, the injured leg planted hard in resistance. Walter stilled his hand, his breath slow. "Easy," he murmured. And then, after long hesitation, the horse allowed the rope to settle across its neck. The moment was so delicate it seemed the air itself paused. He took a step back, giving a gentle tug, and to his astonishment, Comet shifted forward. The limp was pronounced, each movement uneven, but it was a step. A real step. Not just survival. Walter's chest tightened, his throat thick, as though memory itself had risen to choke him. He remembered the first time he had walked again after the rodeo accident, the raw pain and the defiance tangled together. Watching the horse move now was like watching his own spirit stand up once more. Billy clapped his hands before quickly covering his mouth, afraid the sound would startle. But Comet did not retreat. Instead, it lifted its head higher, eyes shining. The boy whispered, "He did it. Mr. Briggs, he really did it." Walter nodded, swallowing hard. "One step," he said hoarsely, "is still a beginning." They spent the rest of the day coaxing the palomino across the small pen. Each attempt was clumsy, the limp dragging like a shadow, yet each try carried a spark of determination. Walter's hand brushed the horse's neck in brief strokes of reassurance, while Billy kept time with whispered words of courage. The stable that had once been silent now carried the rhythm of effort, hooves dragging, rope swaying, breaths shared in unison. As dusk fell, the horse stood sweating lightly, sides heaving but eyes bright. Walter let the rope slip from his hand and stepped back. "That's enough," he said quietly, though his voice shook. Martha entered with lantern light, and in the glow she saw something in her son she hadn't seen in years. Not victory, not even certainty, but a spark of belief. That night, Walter sat by the kitchen window, watching the snow drift outside. Billy had gone home. Martha had retired to her room, and the house was still. On the table lay the bank notice, its words heavy with debt and threat. Yet for the first time, Walter did not stare at it with despair. Instead, he remembered the feel of the rope in his hands, the sight of a horse that refused to give in. He thought of how even a single step could change the course of a life. In the barn, Comet shifted in its stall, hooves scuffing the straw. Walter listened to the sound, faint through the walls, and let it fill the silence. He closed his eyes and whispered into the darkness, "Tomorrow, we'll take another." By December, Montana's land had surrendered to winter. The fields stretched white and endless, fences buried to their rails, the horizon blurring into a sky as gray as ash. Walter rose each morning with his leg stiff and aching, the cold driving deep into old wounds. Yet before the coffee had even cooled in his mug, he was out in the barn, the boy trailing close behind, both drawn by the silent pull of the horse that waited. Comet's golden coat had grown thick, but the shimmer of Palomino still broke against the bleakness of snow, like firelight refusing to die. The limp remained, a stubborn reminder of injury, but the horse moved with more certainty now, more rhythm, as though each step was a declaration against defeat. Walter could not help but feel the same inside his own chest. Winter, however, was not merciful. Storms rolled down from the mountains with winds that screamed through the trees and rattled the windows until sleep was impossible. One night, the gale nearly ripped the barn door from its hinges. Walter and Billy fought shoulder to shoulder against it, the boy's small hands clutching at the wood, Walter's frame straining with every gust. Comet whinnied in alarm, stomping the straw. When they finally forced the door closed and dropped the beam across it, the two collapsed in the hay, laughing breathlessly despite the cold. For a moment, in the chaos, they felt like kin bound not by blood, but by need. Martha stitched blankets by the fire, hands working slowly, her eyes soft when she watched the boy. "He reminds me of you at that age," she told Walter one evening. Restless, stubborn, but with a heart too big for his own good. Walter only grunted, though deep down the words unsettled him. He had been a boy once, too, with dreams larger than the plains. Somewhere along the way, those dreams had been crushed under broken bones, debt, and the harsh arithmetic of survival. Now a horse and a child were daring him to remember what it meant to hope. The days became a rhythm of endurance. Billy shoveled snow from the barn roof so it wouldn't collapse under the weight. Walter mixed warm mash for Comet, the steam rising like comfort in the frozen air. The horse responded with small victories, lifting its injured leg without fear, pressing its muzzle into Walter's shoulder as though seeking warmth. Each gesture mattered. Each one was proof they were not wasting their strength. Yet there were nights that tested more than their bodies. One bitter evening, after hours of keeping lanterns lit against the cold, Walter sat on the bench, rubbing his leg until his ears burned. "Maybe they were right," he muttered, voice low, nearly drowned by the howling wind. "Maybe I threw away everything for nothing." His hand trembled as it rested on the folded mortgage notice tucked into his pocket. The barn seemed to shrink around him, filled with shadows heavier than straw and wood. Billy appeared then, wrapped in Martha's oversized coat, his cheeks red from the cold. He held out a crust of bread he had saved from supper. "I thought he might like it," the boy said. Comet took the offering gently, lips brushing the boy's mittened hand, and the horse chewed, eyes calm, as if the world outside did not rage. Billy turned to Walter, his voice quiet but steady. "He's still fighting, Mr. Briggs. We can't stop before he does." The words settled heavier than the wind. Walter stared at the horse, its breath rising in white clouds, mane glowing faintly in lantern light. He felt something inside him tilt, as though the storm outside had blown away more than snow. It had blown away excuses. When dawn finally broke after the long night, the land was buried deeper, fences nearly gone under drifts. But the barn still stood, and inside 3 figures greeted the morning. A man with weary eyes, a boy with restless hope, and a golden horse that refused to give in. Walter placed his hand against the horse's warm neck and whispered, "We made it." The words were not triumphant, not yet, but they carried the steady truth of survival. Winter was far from over, but so were they. By late January, the worst of the blizzards had passed, leaving behind a landscape of crystalline silence. Snowdrifts glistened in the morning sun, and icicles hung from the barn eaves like glass daggers. Life moved more slowly in the bitter cold. But inside Walter's stable, something fragile had begun to stir, something more precious than survival. Trust. Comet's golden coat gleamed beneath layers of dust, his creamy mane falling in waves across his neck. The limp was still there, a reminder of damage that might never fully heal, yet the horse carried it with a quiet dignity. He no longer pulled away when Walter entered the stall. He no longer pinned his ears at Billy's eager chatter. Instead, there was patience, a watchful calm that hinted at change. Walter had begun massaging the injured leg every evening, his hands steady but careful. At first, the Palomino shivered at his touch, muscles twitching as if to recoil. But Walter spoke softly, his breath visible in the cold air. "Easy, boy. I know it hurts. I know." The horse's flank quivered under his palm, and then, finally, relaxed. Each night after, Comet yielded more, until Walter's rough hands became a comfort rather than a threat. It was during one of these sessions that Billy, crouched by the stall gate, whispered, "Do you think he'll ever let you ride him?" Walter froze, fingers still pressed to the warm hide. The question cut deeper than the boy realized. Years ago, he had dreamed of championships, his legs strong, his spirit reckless. Now he wondered if mounting a horse again would be an act of courage or of foolishness. He swallowed the answer and simply said, "If he ever chooses to let me, that'll be his gift, not mine." The gift came sooner than he expected. One afternoon, after weeks of cautious routine, Walter opened the gate and led Comet into the pale winter sun. The snow crunched under hooves, uneven but deliberate. Billy scampered alongside, laughing when the horse flicked snow into the air. Walter paused in the yard, rope loose in his hand. Without thinking, he placed his palm on the Palomino's shoulder, then slid it up toward the mane. Comet shifted, but did not retreat. The blaze on his forehead caught the sunlight, bright as fire against the snow. Walter's throat tightened. Slowly, almost reverently, he set one foot in the stirrup of the old saddle he had cleaned that morning. Billy held his breath. Walter hesitated, the memories of pain and failure pressing against his ribs. But then Comet stood steady. For the first time since his accident, Walter swung his leg over a horse. It was only a few steps across the yard, uneven and halting, but to him it was a journey across years of silence. He clutched the mane, head bowed, tears freezing at the corners of his eyes. "I'm standing again," he whispered hoarsely. "Because of you." Billy whooped with joy, racing beside them, his boots scattering snow. Martha, watching from the porch, pressed her hand to her lips, her eyes wet. She didn't call out, didn't break the fragile sanctity of the moment. She only stood there, bearing witness to her son's return to something he thought had been lost forever. When Walter finally dismounted, his legs shook, his breath ragged, but his heart felt stronger than it had in years. He pressed his forehead to the horse's neck, the smell of sweat and winter hay filling his lungs. Comet exhaled deeply, a sound like acceptance, like forgiveness. That night, as the household settled under quilts and the wind whistled faintly outside, Walter lingered in the barn. He stood beside the horse, resting his hand on the warm hide, listening to the steady rhythm of breath. For the first time in a long time, the silence inside him was not empty. It was full of hope, of memory, of something almost like grace. The thaw came slowly, turning snow into rivulets that traced dark lines through the fields. The earth smelled of mud and cold grass, and the town shook off winter as if waking from a long, uneasy sleep. Walter had begun leading Comet beyond the stable yard, out to the open pasture, where the horse could test its stride against the softness of thawing ground. Each day, the limp remained, but seemed less like a limitation and more like a mark of survival. Billy ran beside them, cheeks flushed, and even Martha had started to hum again while hanging laundry on the porch. For a time, their little world felt untouched by anything but effort and hope. But word travels faster than spring melt in a small Montana town. Whispers began to drift from porch to porch, from feed store to diner. Briggs is out there training a lame horse. The voices carried amusement, pity, and sometimes cruelty. Men tipped their hats with smirks, and women shook their heads with quiet disbelief. At the hardware store, Walter caught two ranch hands laughing as they loaded fence posts into their truck. "He thinks that Palomino's worth something," one said. "What's next? He gonna race it against Hanson's quarter stock?" Their laughter echoed in Walter's chest long after he walked away. At Sunday service, even the quiet glances carried judgment. Hanson himself, broad and self-satisfied, leaned across the pew after the benediction. "Heard you're putting that horse through its paces," he said, voice dripping with mock sympathy. "You planning to enter the rodeo this spring? Folks could use a laugh." The chuckles that followed burned Walter's ears hotter than the fire in the stove at home. That night, Walter sat in the barn long after Billy had gone home. Comet shifted in the stall, mane falling like cream silk across its neck, eyes steady. Walter whispered, "They think we're a joke." The horse snorted softly, stamping its good hoof as though to argue. Walter reached through the bars and touched the golden coat. "But you don't care, do you? You just keep moving forward." For a moment, Walter envied that indifference, that stubborn will to live without apology. Billy noticed the gossip, too. Children at school teased him, saying he was wasting time with a broken-down nag. Yet the boy arrived every afternoon, shoulders squared, carrying buckets and brushes with renewed determination. "Let him talk," he told Walter one evening as he rubbed Comet's flank. "They don't know him like we do. They don't know you either." His words struck deeper than he knew. Still, the weight of ridicule pressed hard. Walter's pride, already fragile, felt stripped bare. Each time he guided Comet across the yard, he could almost hear the voices mocking, predicting failure. Yet he kept at it, rope in hand, stride steady, eyes set on something beyond their laughter. Martha watched him from the porch and said nothing, but in the quiet way she placed her hand on his shoulder each evening, Walter found strength that words could not give. One morning, as the first buds appeared on the cottonwoods, Hansen rode past with 2 of his ranch hands. He reined in, watching Walter work Comet in the pasture. The horse limped but lifted its head proudly, mane glinting in the sun. Hansen smirked. "Bring that sorry thing to the rodeo, Briggs. Let the crowd see what a waste looks like." Then he spurred his gelding forward, dust rising behind him like laughter trailing on the wind. Walter's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. He glanced at Comet, who met his gaze with eyes unflinching. Billy kicked at the dirt, muttering curses he was too young to know. Walter laid a hand on the boy's shoulder. "We don't answer with words," he said quietly. "We answer by showing up." The boy nodded, though his eyes burned. That evening, Walter leaned against the stall door, watching Comet breathe in the lantern glow. "They'll laugh, sure," he whispered. "But we'll be there anyway." The horse shifted closer, as if to confirm it. And in the silence that followed, Walter felt the stirrings of defiance rising again, an ember he thought long extinguished. The first real warmth of spring melted the last patches of snow, leaving the pastures soft underfoot. Grass pushed through mud, and the air smelled of thawed earth and new beginnings. Walter had begun working Comet harder now, stretching the horse's stride across the pasture, guiding him in circles to build strength in the injured leg. Billy stood at the fence line with wide eyes, notebook in hand, recording every step as if it were scripture. The horse moved unevenly but with growing confidence, golden coat glistening in the pale sun, the blaze on its forehead flashing each time it turned. For a while, it seemed as if their faith had taken root, strong enough to silence the town's laughter. That morning, Walter felt a cautious surge of pride. He had saddled Comet and taken him beyond the pasture into open ground, a place where the horizon stretched wide and the air carried the promise of possibility. Billy ran beside them, panting but grinning, cheering each time the horse managed a smoother stride. Walter sat tall, his limp forgotten for those moments, his heart rising with the rhythm of hooves. He had almost allowed himself to believe that the whispers, the mockery, the debts hanging heavy in his pocket were fading into irrelevance. Almost. It happened suddenly, with no warning. As Comet pushed forward in a trot, his injured leg gave way. The Palomino stumbled, violently, the golden body crashing into the dirt. Walter was thrown, the breath knocked from his lungs as he hit the ground. The world went silent for a beat, only the pounding of his heart filling his ears. He scrambled up, panic flooding him, eyes fixed on the horse that lay trembling, trying and failing to rise. "Get up," Walter whispered, his voice breaking. "Come on, boy. Get up." He dropped to his knees in the mud, pressing his hands into the earth, helpless. Comet struggled, flanks heaving, eyes wide with pain and fear. The sight carved into Walter's chest like a blade. Memories of his own fall came rushing back, the rodeo arena, the screaming crowd, the moment he knew his life had broken in half. And now, here it was again, played out before him, cruelly mirrored. Billy's voice pierced the silence, high and desperate. "Mr. Briggs, is he?" The boy's words cut off in a sob. Walter clenched his fists in the dirt, the sting of helplessness burning through him. "I can't do it," he rasped. "I can't save him, I can't save anyone, couldn't save myself, can't save this damn horse." His voice cracked, raw and ugly, the words dragged from the pit of years of failure. Comet shifted, tried again, and fell back. Walter struck the ground with his fist, mud splattering his coat. Tears blurred his vision. Why'd I think I could change anything? His shoulders shook, his head bowed as the weight of disappointment crushed him. Billy moved closer, his small hand hovering at Walter's back, but afraid to touch. The boy's face was streaked with tears, his faith rattled, but not extinguished. Minutes passed like hours. At last, Comet gathered himself, trembling but determined, and pushed to his feet. The limp was worse, the movement unsteady, but he stood. He stood, while Walter remained on his knees, staring at the horse as though seeing something beyond strength, beyond pain. Comet's breath came hard, clouds of steam rising into the cool air, yet his eyes were steady, fixed on the man before him. Billy knelt beside Walter now, his small hand finally resting against the man's broad shoulder. He didn't quit, the boy whispered. Even hurt, he didn't quit. Don't you quit either. Walter closed his eyes, shame and sorrow twisting inside him. The boy's words struck true, but the wound in his spirit was raw, bleeding with the memory of every lost dream. He pressed his forehead into the crook of his arm, unable to speak. That night, back in the barn, silence reigned heavy. Martha tried to offer comfort with stew and kind words, but Walter barely touched his meal. He sat instead with the lantern burning low, watching Comet shift restlessly in the stall, the limp pronounced. The barn smelled of sweat and damp straw, the air thick with exhaustion. Walter whispered into the stillness. Maybe I was wrong. Maybe I asked too much of both of us. His words dissolved into the dark, unanswered. Comet lowered his head to the straw, weary but unbroken. Billy, curled on a pile of blankets nearby, stirred and mumbled in his sleep. Walter looked at them both, the boy and the horse, and felt a jagged edge of despair slice through him. For the first time since the auction, he wondered if this gamble had been a mistake too big to bear. The barn remained heavy with silence the morning after Comet's fall. The golden horse shifted uneasily in the straw, his limp sharper than before, while Walter sat slouched on the wooden bench, eyes fixed on the dirt floor as if answers might rise from the dust. The lantern from the night before still burned low, a reminder that he hadn't slept. Outside, the first true thaw of spring had turned the yard to mud, water dripping from the eaves with a steady, mocking rhythm. Billy entered quietly, carrying a dented lunch pail. He stopped just inside the door, his face pale with worry but determined. For a long while he said nothing, only watching Walter, who seemed smaller somehow, folded into himself. Finally, the boy set the pail down and stepped closer. He's still standing, Billy said softly, glancing at Comet. He didn't give up. Walter shook his head. He's hurt worse now. I pushed him too far, just like I did to myself. His voice cracked, each word dragged from a place too raw to hide. Maybe I should have let him go at that auction. Maybe all I did was buy us both more suffering. The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he did not look away. He had seen Walter strong and silent, but this was the first time he had seen him broken. It frightened him, but it also called something out of him, something brave. You didn't buy suffering, Billy said, his voice trembling but steadying as he went on. You gave him a chance, and he gave one to you. That's what you told me, remember? That trust is a gift. Walter raised his eyes, weary and doubtful. Billy swallowed hard, then crossed the dirt floor until he stood beside the man. He placed his small hand on Walter's rough, scarred one. You can't stop now. Not when he's still fighting. He stood up after he fell. Even hurt, he stood. Doesn't that mean something? The words pierced deeper than Walter wanted to admit. He looked at the boy, saw the stubborn fire in his young face, the same fire he once carried before life had beaten it thin. Martha's voice echoed in his memory. Sometimes we don't save the horse. Sometimes the horse saves us. Walter turned toward Comet. The Palomino stood with head lowered but eyes steady, the white blaze catching faint morning light. It wasn't the look of a defeated animal. It was the look of one who refused to surrender, even when every step hurt. Walter's chest tightened as he realized the boy was right. He rose slowly, his legs stiff, and approached the stall. Comet shifted, ears flicking, but did not back away. Walter laid a hand against the warm hide, feeling the tremor of muscles beneath. I asked too much of you, he murmured, his voice thick. But if you're still willing, I won't quit. Billy's face brightened, hope flooding his features. He wiped at his cheeks with his sleeve. See? He just needed to hear you say it. The boy's confidence seemed almost too big for his small frame, but it carried the weight Walter could no longer shoulder alone. The rest of the day passed in small, careful steps. Walter did not saddle Comet. Instead, he walked him gently across the yard, pausing often, watching the limp with keen eyes. Billy stayed close, whispering encouragement as though his words could stitch strength into bone. The horse responded with quiet persistence, sweat darkening his golden coat, but never faltering. By dusk, Walter's exhaustion was tempered with a fragile kind of relief. They had not lost everything. They had not given in. He stood with Billy at the fence, watching the horse graze on the first blades of spring grass. He trusts us, Walter said softly. The boy nodded, his grin small but certain. And we trust him. That night, as Walter sat by the kitchen window, Martha poured him tea without asking. She said nothing about his hollow eyes or the mud on his coat. Instead, she touched his shoulder lightly, the way she had done since he was a child. You listened to him, didn't you? She asked quietly. Walter didn't answer, but he didn't need to. In the barn, Comet shifted in the straw, his breath steady, the blaze on his forehead faintly glowing in the lantern's light. Walter felt the boy's words echo inside him. He stood, even hurt. And for the first time since the fall, Walter allowed himself to believe that standing, no matter how unsteady, was enough to carry them forward. By mid-April, Montana had begun to soften under spring's touch. Snow lingered only in shaded gullies, and the meadows stretched green again, dotted with the first wildflowers. The air carried a smell of thawed soil and pine resin, a sweetness that lifted even the heaviest hearts. Walter led Comet out to pasture that morning, his limp steady but less burdensome, as if the season itself offered relief. Billy skipped ahead, his boots splashing through shallow puddles, while Martha stood on the porch with a basket of laundry, humming a tune that carried across the yard. Comet lowered his head to graze, the golden coat shimmering like sunlight itself against the new grass. The limp had not vanished, but there was strength now in each step, a rhythm that spoke of healing. Walter watched closely, his hands folded on the fence rail. He no longer saw only the injury. He saw endurance written into muscle and bone. You're not broken, he murmured, almost to himself. You're becoming something new. Billy dropped to the grass nearby, notebook open across his knees. He scribbled furiously, recording details as though chronicling a miracle. He's eating more, and look, he carries himself taller. the boy announced. Walter glanced at him, surprised by the seriousness in his tone. "One day you'll have enough notes to write a book," he teased. Billy's ears flushed red, but his grin was wide. "Maybe I will. A book about second chances." The days lengthened, filled with chores that no longer felt like burdens. Walter worked the fields with renewed energy, Martha tended her garden, and Billy became almost a fixture in their household. Every evening, they gathered at the fence line to watch Comet trot small circles in the yard. The horse's mane, creamy white against golden hide, flew in the breeze, catching the last rays of sun. It was not speed or grace that moved them, but determination, the steady insistence of life finding its way. Yet spring was not only renewal, it was also preparation. Word spread quickly that the rodeo would return in early summer, the annual gathering where ranchers and riders measured themselves against tradition. Hanson, of course, was already boasting in the diner about his stock, hinting at new bloodlines he would showcase. The mention of Walter's name brought smirks and sideways glances. "Maybe he'll bring that crippled Palomino out," one man chuckled. "Give the crowd something to laugh at." Walter heard these whispers, but did not answer them. Instead, he returned to the barn each night, brushing Comet's coat until it gleamed, his silence saying more than words could. He did not know if he would bring the horse to the rodeo. He only knew that the animal deserved to be seen for what it had become, not for what it had lost. One evening, while the sky blazed pink over the mountains, Billy asked, "Do you think we should take him?" Walter paused, hand stilling on the brush. "It's not about showing him off," he said carefully. "It's about showing up. For him. For us." The boy nodded solemnly, as if accepting a truth too large for his age. The season deepened, and so did the bond. Comet followed Walter without rope now, his steps uneven but sure, his trust absolute. The horse nuzzled Billy's shoulder whenever the boy approached, and Martha often shook her head in quiet wonder at how far they had come. Their lives, once defined by silence and loss, now carried a rhythm of hope that matched the new season's song. As Walter stood one night on the hill above the farm, the fields glowing green below, Comet grazed nearby, the blaze on his forehead catching the last sliver of light. The man breathed deeply, the air rich with the scent of grass and thawed earth. For the first time in years, he allowed himself not just to survive the present moment, but to imagine a future, one that might be uncertain, but not empty. The rodeo posters appeared first in the windows of the diner, then on the corkboard at the feed store, and finally nailed to fence posts along the dusty road into town. Bright letters announced the annual spring rodeo, the one event that drew the whole county together. For Walter, the sight of those posters was like an old wound reopening. Once, he had been the rider everyone watched. Now he was the man they laughed about in whispers. Hanson fueled those whispers with ease. At the cafe counter, with his hat tipped back and a grin that never softened, he spoke loudly enough for all to hear. "Briggs has been training that lame Palomino all winter. Maybe he'll bring it to the rodeo this year. Folks need a good laugh after all that snow." Laughter followed him like dust in his wake, and no one contradicted him. Walter heard the comments, though rarely directly. They came to him like echoes, through Billy, who overheard boys at school, or through Martha, who saw the glances at church. each one cut, even when he pretended otherwise. One evening, after returning from town, he stood in the barn brushing Comet's coat harder than he meant to, the strokes rough, almost punishing. The horse shifted uneasily, and Walter forced himself to slow, ashamed. He rested his forehead against the golden hide. "They won't stop, will they?" he whispered. Billy leaned against the stall, eyes full of urgency. "Then don't let them be right. Show them what he is. What you both are." Walter looked at the boy, torn between fear and defiance. "If I take him there, they'll laugh. They'll jeer. And if he falters again..." His voice faltered instead. The memory of the fall still burned fresh in his mind, the mud on his hands, the despair that nearly crushed him. The boy shook his head fiercely. "They'll laugh no matter what, but if you walk away now, you'll be the one proving them right. If you show up, maybe they'll see what I see." His small voice carried a conviction larger than the room. For days after, Walter wrestled with the choice. He worked the fields, paid what little he could toward bills that never seemed to shrink, and tried to bury the question beneath routine. But each time he led Comet across the pasture, the horse's steady gaze seemed to ask it again. "Will you stand with me, even when the world is watching?" The answer came late one night. Walter was mending a broken strap in the lamplight when Martha sat beside him. She didn't speak at first, only folded her hands in her lap. Finally, she said, "Your father once told me pride was a dangerous thing. But sometimes it's not about pride. It's about dignity. You've already given that horse his dignity back. Maybe it's time you claim yours, too." Walter set the strap down and rubbed his face, exhausted. "And if we fail?" Her voice was steady. "Then at least you fail standing." When rodeo day finally arrived, the town buzzed with energy. Trucks lined the dusty lot, children darted between stalls with cotton candy, and the announcer's voice boomed over loudspeakers. Hanson's horses pranced in polished saddles, drawing admiration from the crowd. And then whispers began as Walter led Comet. Through the gate, heads turning, smirks curling, laughter bubbling like a cruel tide. Billy walked close at his side, chin lifted high though his hands shook. Martha sat in the stands, her gaze never leaving her son. Walter's heart pounded against his ribs, his limp more pronounced under the weight of every eye on him. Yet when he glanced at Comet, he saw no fear. The Palomino walked steadily, golden coat gleaming, blaze catching the sun as if it carried its own light. The announcer's voice faltered a moment, surprised, before recovering. "And here we have Walter Briggs, with a Palomino some of you might recognize." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Hanson tipped his hat mockingly, the smirk wide on his face. Walter closed his eyes briefly, exhaling. When he opened them, he laid a hand on Comet's neck. The horse flicked an ear. Steady. Waiting. Billy squeezed his arm. "We're here. That's what matters." And with that, Walter stepped into the arena, the noise of ridicule surrounding him like a storm. He did not know if the crowd would ever see what he saw, but he knew this. They were no longer hiding in silence. They were here, together. The roar of the rodeo grounds pressed down like a storm as Walter led Comet through the narrow chute and into the blinding sunlight of the arena. Dust rose in swirls around their boots and hooves, and the air smelled of sweat, leather, and fried food from concession stands. The stands were packed. Ranch families, townsfolk, children waving flags, and every eye followed them. The laughter was immediate, sharp as a whip. "There he is!" someone jeered. Briggs and his crippled showpiece. Another voice joined. Hope you brought glue for when it falls apart again. The crowd's amusement grew, spilling into pockets of mock applause. Hansen sat near the front, hat tilted back, smile wide with satisfaction. He didn't need to speak. His smirk said everything. Walter's throat tightened, his leg ached with each step, and for a fleeting moment he wanted nothing more than to turn back, to retreat into the safety of shadows. But then he felt Billy's small hand squeeze his own. The boy walked beside him with chin lifted, eyes fixed on Comet, not on the crowd. Martha, seated high in the bleachers, clasped her hands together, her gaze steady, as though her will alone could hold them upright. Walter stopped in the center of the ring, dust swirling around their ankles. He turned to Comet, brushing his fingers against the horse's golden neck. The Palomino's ears flicked back briefly at the noise, but then steadied, eyes fixed forward, blaze on his forehead glowing in the afternoon sun. He was ready, waiting. Walter inhaled deeply, blocking out the noise, grounding himself in the simple rhythm of the animal's breath. The announcer's voice crackled through the loudspeakers. Ladies and gentlemen, Walter Briggs returning to the rodeo arena with his horse, Comet. The tone wavered, caught between mockery and disbelief. More laughter followed, rippling through the stands like fire catching dry grass. And then Walter moved. He gave the faintest signal, and Comet stepped forward. One stride, then another, halting, uneven yet deliberate. The laughter faltered. Another step, the limp visible but carried with dignity, the golden coat glinting as though it absorbed the light of every eye upon it. A hush began to fall, slow at first, then spreading like a tide pulling the noise out of the air. By the third circle of the arena, the silence was absolute. No jeers, no chuckles, no applause. Only the sound of hooves dragging lightly through dust and the creak of Walter's saddle as he leaned forward. He didn't ask for speed or grace. He only asked Comet to keep moving, and the horse answered with steady resilience. The quiet became so deep that even the children in the stands stilled, holding their breath. Walter felt tears sting his eyes. He hadn't expected silence to feel like this, so heavy, so reverent. He leaned close to the horse's mane and whispered words only Comet could hear. They see you now, not for what you lost, but for what you are. The Palomino lifted his head higher, ears pricked, eyes clear, and carried Walter past Hansen's seat. The rancher no longer smirked. His expression had hardened, jaw tight. The silence pressed on him too, but in it was no laughter, no victory, only the sight of dignity that could not be mocked away. When the ride ended, Walter dismounted slowly, his leg stiff, his breath unsteady. He laid his forehead briefly against Comet's neck, and the horse exhaled deeply, a sound of release. The crowd remained quiet, almost reverent, as though they were unsure what they had just witnessed. It was Billy who broke the stillness first. He clapped, loud and certain, the sound echoing in the arena. Martha followed, her hands firm and unashamed. And then, slowly, the rest of the stands joined, not with raucous cheer, but with a swelling, heartfelt applause that carried weight rather than mockery. Walter closed his eyes, letting the sound wash over him. He had not come here to win or to prove anything to Hansen. He had come to stand, to be seen. And in that silence, before the applause began, he had found what he sought. Dignity restored, not just to a man, but to a horse who had never stopped fighting. The applause began softly, hesitant at first, like a breeze stirring tall grass. Walter stood beside Comet in the center of the arena, his hat lowered, his hand resting against the horse's warm neck. The golden Palomino lifted his head proudly, ears flicking as if listening not to the crowd, but to the rhythm of his own heart. The silence that had stunned the stands moments earlier gave way to something deeper: recognition. The announcer, who had faltered before, found his voice again. "Ladies and gentlemen, Walter Briggs and Comet." There was no sarcasm now, no laughter. His tone carried respect he hadn't expected to feel. The applause swelled, rising from the bleachers like a wave, not raucous but steady, as if the town had realized it was not watching a joke, but a testament. Walter drew a long breath, and with a subtle signal, Comet stepped forward once more. Together, they began a slow, deliberate circle of the arena. Dust rose in a gentle haze around them, catching the sunlight until it seemed as though they moved through a halo. Each step was imperfect, the limp undeniable, but the dignity of it was unshakable. The crowd leaned forward in silence again, not wanting to break the fragile sanctity of the moment. Billy pressed against the rails, his small hands gripping the wood so tightly his knuckles turned white. His eyes glistened as he whispered, "They're doing it. They're really doing it." Martha, in the stands, let tears roll freely down her cheeks, her hands clasped at her heart. Around her, neighbors who had once mocked now wiped their eyes, their laughter forgotten. As Walter and Comet moved, memories crashed through him. The blinding lights of a rodeo long ago, the cheers when he was young, the fall that had shattered his dreams, the endless nights of silence afterward. And now, here he was again, not as a champion, but as a man who refused to disappear. He leaned forward, his hand sliding into the creamy mane, whispering so only the horse could hear. "We're not proving them wrong. We're proving we're still here." Comet snorted as if in answer, and lifted his stride, each uneven step a declaration. By the time they reached the far end of the circle, the crowd erupted again, not in ridicule, not in pity, but in raw, human recognition of courage. The sound grew, echoing against the wooden beams of the stands, rising higher than the announcer's voice until the whole arena seemed to shake with it. Hansen sat rigid near the front row, his smirk long gone. His jaw clenched, his eyes dark with something that looked uncomfortably like envy. For once, he had no words, no laughter, only silence pressed upon him by the will of the crowd. Walter guided Comet back to the center of the arena. Dust clung to his boots, sweat streaked the horse's golden coat, but both stood tall. He removed his hat slowly, not in showmanship, but in gratitude, holding it over his chest. The crowd rose to their feet, applause surging like thunder, filling every corner of the arena. Billy shouted over the noise, his voice high and triumphant. "That's our circle of glory!" Walter turned slightly toward the boy, meeting his tear-streaked grin, and felt something shift inside him. The bitterness of years loosened, replaced by a quiet pride not dependent on victory or wealth. It was pride in having stood, in having refused to let despair write the last line of his story. When the circle ended, Walter slid from the saddle carefully, his leg stiff but steady. He pressed his forehead to Comet's neck, breathing in the mix of sweat, dust, and spring air. "We did it," he whispered, though his voice broke. "Not perfect, not clean, but we did it." The horse exhaled deeply, steady and calm, as though to agree. The announcer tried to speak again, but his words were drowned by the roar of the crowd. What mattered was no longer in the program, no longer in competition. What mattered was the bond between a man and a horse who had been cast aside, and the undeniable truth that they were still standing. And as Walter led Comet out of the arena, Billy ran to meet them, throwing his arms around the horse's neck, his laughter and tears mingling. Martha followed slowly, her eyes shining as she whispered, "Your father would have been proud." Walter met her gaze and nodded, unable to speak, his throat thick with emotion. In the fading afternoon light, they left the arena not as champions, but as something greater, survivors who had reclaimed dignity, one circle of glory at a time. The noise of the rodeo still echoed in Walter's ears as the dust settled behind them. They walked slowly back toward the truck, Billy skipping ahead and circling back like a puppy too full of joy to be still. Comet's golden coat was streaked with sweat, his steps uneven but steady, his head high as though the applause still vibrated through his bones. Martha caught up with them near the gate, her eyes bright, her cheeks wet. She placed her hand over Walter's arm, her voice breaking. "You showed them, not with words, but with courage." Walter nodded, unable to trust his voice. He felt raw, stripped open by the silence and the cheers, as though years of bitterness had been pulled from him in that arena. Yet it wasn't triumph that filled him. It was something quieter, deeper. Relief. Gratitude. The sense that he had finally come full circle, not as the rodeo star he once dreamed to be, but as a man who had chosen dignity over despair. The crowd outside the arena did not treat him the same as before. Strangers came forward, tipping their hats, speaking softly. "That was something to see, Briggs. Never thought I'd be wiping my eyes at a rodeo." Even those who had once laughed met his gaze with a new weight, as though they understood that what they had witnessed was not performance, but redemption. Hansen did not approach. He stayed behind, stiff in his saddle, jaw tight as the world moved around him. His silence spoke louder than any insult. That evening, back at the farm, the air was thick with the scent of spring grass and wood smoke. Billy refused to stop retelling the story, mimicking the circle in the arena with outstretched arms, his laughter carrying across the yard. Martha set stew on the table, her movement slower, but filled with peace. "You've given this family something I thought we'd lost," she said, as Walter settled heavily into his chair. "Hope." Walter glanced toward the open window, where Comet stood grazing in the twilight, the blaze on his forehead glowing faintly in the last of the sun. "He gave it," Walter said softly. "I just held on." The days that followed seemed different, lighter. Billy continued to come each afternoon, but now he carried himself with pride, no longer shrinking from the taunts of classmates. The boy had witnessed ridicule turn to reverence, and it had shaped him. He worked harder, laughed louder, and wrote in his notebook with renewed determination, as if the story he was recording had become part of his own identity. Martha, too, seemed younger. She moved through her garden with a song on her lips, her steps less burdened by worry. She often paused to stroke Comet's muzzle, whispering words no one else could hear. Walter would watch from the porch, his chest tightening with a strange sweetness. He realized that healing did not belong only to him or to the horse, but to all of them. One evening, as the sky burned with the colors of sunset, Walter led Comet to the top of the hill. Billy followed, breathless, his boots kicking up dust, while Martha climbed slowly behind. From the crest, they could see the valley spread wide, the fields greening, the mountains silvered in snow, the town nestled small and distant. Comet stood at the edge, mane tossing in the wind, body outlined by the fading sun. Walter placed his hand on the horse's neck and turned to his family. "We don't need trophies," he said quietly. "What we did out there, it wasn't about winning. It was about being seen and about seeing ourselves again." Martha nodded, tears shining in her eyes. Billy grinned, his voice breaking with excitement. "We showed them what second chances look like." As the light dimmed, Walter felt the weight of years slide from his shoulders. For the first time, the ache in his leg didn't feel like a chain. It felt like a reminder, a scar that spoke of survival. Comet shifted beside him, strong despite the limp, a mirror of his own spirit. And as night fell over Montana, Walter understood that what had begun as a desperate gamble at an auction had become something far greater. It had become a story of healing, not just for a horse, not just for a man, but for every heart that had chosen to believe again. The spring days grew longer, and with them came a stillness that settled over the Briggs farm like a blessing. Life returned to its ordinary rhythm, fields to plow, fences to mend, bills that still arrived in their relentless way. But something fundamental had shifted. Where once there had been silence filled with regret, now there was laughter in the yard, footsteps in the barn, and the steady presence of a horse who had carried them all into a new season of life. One evening, as the sun slid low behind the mountains, Walter led Comet up the hill that overlooked the valley. The climb was slow, Walter's limp heavy on the incline, Comet's stride uneven but unyielding, but neither hurried. Billy bounded. Ahead, his arms outstretched as if the hill itself were a stage built just for him, while Martha followed more carefully, pausing now and then to catch her breath. The sky burned with colors too rich for words, gold, rose, and deep violet streaks across a canvas of fading blue. At the crest, Comet stopped, mane lifting in the breeze, golden coat ignited by the last blaze of sunlight. Walter stood beside him, one hand resting on the horse's neck, the other bracing against his own thigh. He looked out over the land, the fields greening with promise, the town small in the distance, the mountains eternal on the horizon. For years, he had seen only loss in that view, a reminder of what he once was and could never be again. Tonight, he saw something different. He saw home. Billy dropped into the grass, breathless, his grin wide. "This is where he belongs," he said, nodding at the horse. "Up high, where everyone can see." Martha settled beside him, her hand resting gently on the boy's back. "And where you belong too," she added, her voice soft but sure. Walter's throat tightened. He turned to Comet, pressing his forehead against the warm hide, inhaling the scent of grass and sweat and sun. The horse shifted slightly, steady under his touch. "You're lame," Walter whispered, his voice breaking. "But you carried me back to being a man. You gave me more than I ever gave you." The words hung in the air, carried by the wind across the valley. Martha's eyes glistened, though she did not speak. Billy reached out, stroking Comet's creamy mane with reverence. In that moment, the three of them stood bound together by something larger than chance, larger than pain. They were a family. Not perfect, not whole in the way the world measured, but whole in the ways that mattered. The sun dipped lower, setting the horizon aflame. Shadows stretched long, and the world seemed to pause, holding its breath in reverence for the quiet triumph standing on that hill. Walter straightened, his limp forgotten for the moment, and slipped his arm across Billy's shoulders. Martha leaned against his other side. Together, they watched as Comet raised his head, ears pricked, eyes bright with a defiance that had never been broken. No trophies gleamed, no ribbons fluttered in the air. Yet the image on that hill was richer than any prize. A man who had once been lost, a boy who had longed for belonging, a mother who had carried them both through storms, and a horse who had been thrown aside as useless, now bound together in dignity, in healing, in the quiet, unshakable truth of second chances. As the last light spilled across the valley, Walter whispered again, so softly only the horse could hear, "We made it." And Comet, golden against the dying sun, stood tall, carrying them all into the peace of the evening. And now, it's your turn. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 0 or 1 in the comments below. I'll be reading every single one. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next stories of hope, healing, and the unbreakable bond between humans and animals are already waiting for you.